Hello and welcome to Careers in Tech Summer Series. Our featured speaker tonight is Dan Wolfson, for just as part of the Distinguished Visitor Program for the Computer Society. There are additional meetings throughout July and August for this series. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to our speaker for tonight. All right, Dan, you should be able to share your screen at this point.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Excellent. Let me share my screen. Okay, I think everybody can see this. Yes? Okay. So today we'll talk about accelerating sustainability initiatives through data governance and with using the Egeria open source project. As Michael said, my name is Dan Wolfson. I retired from IBM as a distinguished engineer. I've been a distinguished engineer for over 20 years there as a technical executive, and was the CTO for several different business units, including around what we were doing around sustainability and really some of the analysis, environmental analysis around global warming from an analytics perspective, and working with big data and analytics around that. Prior to that, I was the CTO for the product offerings that IBM had around data governance and data integration, and so forth. And so I've been in this data space and analytics space for well over 30 years, 40 years, because I came to IBM through an acquisition. And once I left, a couple of friends of mine and I started a little consulting company called Pragmatic Data Research, and we are also the driving force behind the Egeria, the Linux Foundation Egeria open source project, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so there's a lot of topics that I want to touch on today. I don't think we'll necessarily be able to go into as much depth. If there's questions along the way, people can feel free to raise their hand or speak up. I want to do a little bit of introduction to data governance. Not everybody is familiar with it, and some of those that are familiar with it view it as perhaps a necessary evil. And I want to touch on that a little bit and explain how it's actually not only important, but can accelerate other activities, especially around analytics. Spend just a little bit of time on the Egeria open source project, open metadata governance project, why we created it and what it does. And then we'll talk mostly about how we can use these to accelerate sustainability initiatives through data governance and what some of the sustainability challenges are. There's an increasing amount of government regulation, as well as really requirements being driven by the financial community around reporting on your sustainability progress as well as state. And so most major organizations, not only corporations, but also political units, are having to do that. And then we can talk a little bit about applying some of the data governance approaches with Egeria. So before we get into data governance directly, it's useful to talk a little bit about data strategy. And everybody, data is pretty popular these days as a topic. There's the whole analogy of data is like oil, and you want to be able to extract it from the organization, and you can just have money flowing down. It's not like that at all, but it is critical, and it's really important as enterprises move more towards digitalization, as well as are trying to leverage more analytics, whether it's traditional analytics or more AI-oriented analytics. And I've had plenty of experience with both. But the foundation for all of that is having good data. And so you need a data strategy that helps you to understand what your data is and how it is aligned to your business strategy or your organizational strategy. And so that ties in with what we start to look at in a data governance program, which is aligned with the business strategy. And you have that governance strategy that's tied into also the regulation and compliance side of the business. Regulated industries such as banking and power generation and others are tightly regulated and have to deliver auditable reports. And those reports are, of course, built on data. And so you need to have traceability of the information that you provide and transparency of the information that you provide. And really, this comes down to having a set of governance principles, set of obligations that you have to deliver against. And there's a number of approaches that you have. This is also critical when we start to think about the internet privacy as well. And so we have regulations like in Europe, the GDPR, the Global Data Protection Regulation, which protects the individual's personal information and describes a set of requirements that companies that have a web presence have to provide. There's similar regulations in California and in Brazil, and maybe we'll get it across the US in a consistent way, although that remains to be seen. But whenever we do this, and when we need to be able to protect that information, that's also an aspect of data governance. And so under the covers, there are a set of technical controls that we need to establish, a set of classifications that we use on the information that drive both the technical controls and the organizational controls. And that really devolves down into sets of projects that we have. And so that's the basic structure of a governance program. And as we'll see, as we look into the sustainability initiatives, it's another instance of this kind of structure. Now, this, as I mentioned, ties into the overall digital service lifecycle. And when we start to think about understanding the data landscape that we have in an organization or across an organization, then we start to look at what the different life cycles are and how they interrelate and how we respond to both protect our data and what we do when there is a security breach or a data incident. And that can come in a number of ways. In some cases, it's literally somebody has stolen some data, what's impacted, but it could also be that somebody has intentionally or not corrupted data, and what are the downstream systems that need to be protected against that data corruption. Because the data really flows across what we think of as an information supply chain, that where the data is produced throughout the supply chain, it's produced, processed, consumed by others as it moves down that supply chain, and then delivered for other use and further processed and so forth. And so we need to think about the overall health of the supply chain, not just of the individual data itself. And it can be a pretty daunting task, which we have to approach incrementally. The main components of a data governance program are not just the technology. The technology is an enabler, and it can help to reduce and manage costs and improve consistency through automation, but also the people and organization structures around that, the roles and the responsibility structure, the processes that people need to follow, and technology needs to follow around the handling of information, and of course the data itself, providing an audit trail and evidence in order to make the proper decisions. And so it's really all four of those have to come together. It's not just a technology issue. When we start to think about governance in the enterprise, we need to think through what are the minimal agreements on obligations and delegations that we need in order to be able to exchange information. That's at a minimal side, but in an ideal world, there'd be this governance would allow us to share more information across the different tools and systems and organizations that people have. In fact, we have been involved with a foreign government where they're looking at how do they better facilitate communication and data through data exchange between the different ministries that they have. And so they want to achieve better collaboration as well as streamlining of the data. But you need to establish some agreements on what the definitions of things are. What does a regulation mean? What does even an employee mean? Does it mean the same thing in one ministry versus another ministry? In fact, one of the problems that they came to us to talk about was the minister across the information organizations said, "How do I know how many employees I have?" And so it sounds like a very simple question, but it's actually pretty complicated because what is an employee? An employee in one organization may include part-time and full-time, and in another organization, it might include contractors or not include contractors. And if an employee is on loan from one organization to another organization, do they end up being double counted or are they counted once? And so all of these rules and definitions and semantics around the different concepts and the different kinds of information that we keep is incredibly important. And what we need to do with our data governance systems is to be able to capture that information so that it can be shared. It's not that you're going to get everybody to agree on the same definition of employee, but at least you can know that if this organization says it's an employee, I can map that to this other notion of employee in another organization. And you start to understand the semantics here of what's going on, not just I can flow this field of information from here to there. And that's really important to start to understand and recognize the need for semantic integration. And because really at the end of the day, you end up, and we'll talk about this more, you end up with knowledge graphs over what's going on. So within an enterprise, ideally we often have with silos of different tools. And so different organizations and different roles of people have their own favorite tools, whether it's ETL tools over here and maybe a Hadoop ecosystem over there, and maybe it's Snowflake or another large quasi data lake system in another place, whether it's different quality tools or analysis tools or analytics tools. And so there's a plethora of tools all over the place. And by and large, they do not do a good job of sharing information about what they know of the underlying systems and data with each other. And so that's a big problem. And that means that a lot of effort has to go into making these tools work together and being able to exchange and collaborate across different roles and different organizations. So when we start to look at the different governance focus areas from a business perspective, we can talk about things like risk management or intellectual property, export controls. Export controls are often, we don't talk about it as much in the US. In the EU, it's much more, a much bigger topic of discussion. But for example, if you have a multinational bank, that has, let's say, a subsidiary in Turkey. In Turkey, the banking data is not allowed to leave the country, and so you have to, if you're a Turkish bank and you want to, let's say, use a cloud, whatever cloud provider you want, you can't just use a cloud that may be in a different country. You have to actually have a local instance of that cloud in Turkey, and you have to have ways that guarantee that the sovereignty of the data does not leave the country. And so when we have these complex cloud systems, we have to think about the data sovereignty and what the implications are in terms of the flow of information across borders. We can talk about financial reporting, privacy, health and safety, and so forth. And when we start to look within the governance domains under the covers, we start to talk about data governance or information governance, IT infrastructure governance, the physical systems and software that supports them themselves, and cybersecurity all need to come together. And that, of course, has to tie in with the software lifecycle and DevOps. I'm not going to go through all the details of these pictures, but mostly they're here just to provide a flavor of the kinds of layouts of systems that we see. But you'll see discovery engines and data catalogs and data curation tools and business glossary authoring tools. And often in many organizations, these are completely different things that don't always talk to each other. Part of what we're trying to do within the Egeria project is to make it easier for them to talk to each other. And so we can talk about data, what you need for data awareness, and we can start to add on to it when you start to get to governance awareness, and now you're doing more curation of what's going on, doing more integration across these different kinds of systems. When we start to embed governance, we start to look at how we take the governance definitions and perhaps automation, let's say for privacy rules or security, and tie that into the data runtimes, ETL engines, databases, and so forth, so that the rules are implemented automatically. We can talk about implementing business-driven governance, which again is aligning this to the business needs and the business goals and objectives, tying this. That's where things such as the glossary end up being very important, because that's often more oriented towards a business user, but allows that information and their needs to now integrate in with the technical metadata that could be collected elsewhere. And then ultimately we can get to data citizenship, which brings a lot of these concepts together and really is about providing a much more self-service data access environment and better shareability and collaboration around the data and the metadata itself. Okay, so that was a little whirlwind tour of data governance. Let me pause here for a second to see if there's any quick questions before we move on. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the Egeria Open Metadata and Governance Project. Egeria is a project that originally we started about 4 years ago, when I and my colleagues were at IBM. IBM was one of the initiators of the project, along with ING Bank in the Netherlands, SAS Analytics in North Carolina, and a number of other companies as well. And we worked together. We started working with the Atlas system that's part of the Hadoop ecosystem, but kind of quickly outgrew that, and were encouraged to start our own project, open source project under the Linux Foundation, which is what we did. And so Egeria is an open source project, meaning that it's free, not only free for anybody to use without charge, but that all of the source is available and can be used and modified in any way that you want. But most importantly is that we encourage and really seek out people that are interested in this topic to help contribute to it, both requirements as well as coding. And the community that we build around Egeria decides how Egeria should evolve over time. And it is constantly evolving. We have a new release every couple of months or so, and that often has many new features. And so Egeria itself is a set of libraries. It's a set of servers, and it is an integrated system that handles, I don't know, well over 1,000 different types of information at this point. It's a fairly large system. It's not only about traditional data, it also handles messaging data and APIs and physical infrastructure and analytics and AI and other things are all known within the system. And I won't spend too much time on this. You can go to the URL. There you've got hundreds of pages of documentation there. But the main point is that it is open and that it is available for everybody to use. What our little company does is it supports users when they need it with some consulting. Most of the time, we actually are working on Egeria itself, to be honest, and continue to extend that. But Egeria's value really is enabling the sharing of the information between people and processes across different tools and technologies. And so it does not a hub and spoke architecture, it's more of a peer-to-peer sharing of information that allows us to connect up different kinds of tools so that one tool that you may have already deployed can access information from another tool that you may already have deployed. If they both decide, if the owner of the information decides that they're willing to share it, and the consumer of the information wants to consume it. And so Egeria facilitates that collaboration between those tools and those people. It also can manage the metadata itself and can store a copy of it for caching and efficiency, but it doesn't try to own everything because there can be no single owner of a metadata system that lasts for a long time. We've seen that architecture fail time and time again. What happens is it either breaks up into little silos or people create a pristine data catalog that they think is the be all and end all, and then it's so complicated that nobody can use it. And so it stops being used and it comes out of date very quickly. So instead, what we strive to do is to make it easy to hook up the technologies and the tools that you already have, not force you to buy all new ones, and to incrementally be able to evolve your system so that you can continuously improve the collaboration and the shareability and the governance of your data and your systems. So that's what we do within Egeria. Egeria itself, just a little picture, it does the metadata integration. We basically pulled in as many standards and libraries as we can. We've been working across the spectrum with different software vendors. Some of them you'll see on our website that participate in the community, that build their software either on top of Egeria or they integrate with Egeria. And so our goal is to spread it out even more and to get more people to incorporate it into what they do. Now, I mentioned the type system, and this is just a very rough idea of what it is. These are the different areas of types within Egeria. We have governance, we have lineage, which is how does information flow through the system, and there's many different varieties of lineage that we can talk about. There's, of course, base types and systems and infrastructure. So this is a computer, this is a network, this is a string, this is an object, whatever. There's data assets, which is where the data is held and owned. There's the glossary information, which adds semantics around that can be tied to other things, but doesn't have to be. So it could be a full taxonomy in some cases, or semantic network. It could be, or could be much looser, and that's kind of up to you. And you can have many glossaries, and they can play different roles. There's support for collaboration between people and groups and projects and comments, and adding in a lot of the human element around this. Models and reference data. Reference data is hugely important, often overlooked. But if everybody can't agree on what, let's say, the standard colors are, or standard dimensions are, or conversion factors, or geographic names, then it's very hard to really integrate systems together. There's a lot of interesting stories around that. And then metadata discovery, which is, can we figure out what something really means by looking at the actual data itself and doing analysis over that using different analytic and AI techniques. And if we dive into that a little further, we can see the different kinds of things within each of those areas. I won't spend too much time here, but you can see that they're all interrelated. They're not silos in themselves. They're really about having the core concepts and then allowing those concepts to be related in flexible ways so that you can build the right kind of knowledge graph or semantic map over what you have. Okay. And so that's really what Egeria is about under the covers. Just as a quick example, we can look at something, a simple data object, in this particular case, an employee record. It has at the bottom, you can see the set of values associated with it. That set of values we could discover, or could be asserted, we could be told, corresponds to those record elements. And that could be a predefined schema here for an employee record. And then at the top, you can see that we can have a glossary. So employee, and can have an employee has a manager. Those relationships has a synonym, antonym. All those relationships are built into the glossary itself. And so the semantics of this is actually maintained within the glossary, along with additional classifications. We can also indicate where the data is sensitive, and we can classify something like a compensation plan as a sensitive data element that has to be handled appropriately. And that we can also tell through a governance action. We can tell a particular runtime that when you handle this kind of information, then you need to handle it in this particular way. Okay. So let me pause here again. Take a breath, have a drink. Any questions? Okay. So now let's talk about sustainability. And how does an organization become more sustainable? So, as I mentioned earlier, there's both legal and ethical reasons, and business reasons, in fact, as well, for that organizations are caring much more about sustainability. In the EU, there's now a set of regulations in place that requires some organizations, larger organizations to start with, to report on their carbon emissions, for example, as well as other aspects of sustainability on a yearly basis. And every year for the next several years, that will spread out from the very big organizations in a few industries to basically everybody in the EU that has a business will need to be doing some of that reporting. It'll be simpler for the smaller organizations, more sophisticated for the larger organizations. That's already in place in the UK. It's in place in Australia. And it's increasingly being not necessarily regulated, regulatory. It's not a regulatory requirement completely in the US yet, but the financial industry, Wall Street, is taking a very strong stance that if you are not considering and planning for climate change in your business, then you are not properly planning for the different risks and opportunities that will result from climate change. And you are also expected to be reporting on your sustainability posture, as well as what your plans are to improve your sustainability posture. And that information is used in asset management, where the traders are making decisions about what companies to buy and sell, as well as which companies to make what kinds of loans to. So it quickly becomes very important, especially to the larger organizations in the US, corporations in the US. And you can generally go to anybody's website these days and get some view of their sustainability results. It's not perfect, and it's getting better, but it is getting better, and it is starting to happen. And so doing this is actually, and reporting on your carbon emissions is actually fairly complicated, and it depends on what kind of industry you're in. I'll walk through some examples of that in a minute, but when we start to look at carbon emissions, we need to look across all the different types of facilities. If you're a bank, then most of your carbon emissions are really going to be reflected through your office buildings and your computer centers, and small amounts of pockets of other things. But you also need to look at that across different sites, and you'll want to compare different sites against each other so that you can look for best practices, as well as places where you might need more management attention to correct. You tend to focus on the use of resources, and a lot of that is reducing waste, sourcing from responsible suppliers, reducing emissions. And you need to be able to establish realistic improvement targets and a program to execute against them. So monitoring emissions, resources, business practices, and really leverage the innovation that you have within your workforce to continue to improve your processes and operations, and then report and evaluate on the progress. What's also happening is not just reporting that you have this, but the results that you report are expected to be auditable by a third party. And that is very important, because it means that we need to establish the traceability of the information that we use in that reporting. And we need to be able, and part of that is being able to have that lineage information that we talked about earlier, as well as an understanding of the systems in place. And so that's how it quickly becomes a data governance program in support of the sustainability program. When we look at Egeria, Egeria itself supports a lot of these different activities that you need to follow. We can establish and manage the overall sustainability program, represent that, help to survey the available data and processes. If you already have a governance program, if you have a data catalog, we can use that or help you to extend that. And then you build an analytic and reporting pipeline that computes your greenhouse gas emissions. And then, of course, you need to be able to support the validation and the review of the results. And so there's a little journey map here where, we start with the mission definition, and then what we need to do to set up that mission to execute that governance program, the sustainability program. There's when we set up the mission, we start to look at what's the glossary, what's the definition of the terms that we have, and the governance configuration, the different kinds of roles. As we set that up, we look at who is in charge and what responsibilities, and who's supposed to be helping with this, what are the different subject areas, the different kinds of expertise that we need to pull in. And then you start to survey the environment. You start to catalog, and maybe you already have one. That's great. So you use what you already have. But if you don't, then you start to look at where the holes are, the gaps are in your understanding of the data that you need in order to support your sustainability reporting. You go through and you select the data. You might classify it in different ways to be able to keep track of it. It's going to have to be aggregated together, building a different, basically a little kind of a data mart. Could be physical, could be virtual, that you can then do your reporting and dashboarding on, and supporting that, of course, are data pipelines and analytics and that. And then you need to be able to support the reviewing of the information supply chains that you have, and then plan for what you're doing next, do either certifications and get review over what you have. And often there's many different loops and feedbacks within this. And so in Egeria, as I said, we build a bit of a knowledge graph. And if we have time at the end, I'll show you a little demo of some of this stuff. But we can have, in fact, I built a glossary initially that we can use, and we can give people as a starter, that is based on the greenhouse gas protocol. And we'll talk about this more in a second, but the greenhouse gas protocol, which has been around for a long time, more than 20 years really, but it is really the fundamental standard that people use in order to build out a sustainability program and to do your carbon or sustainability reporting. And so it's a set of standards, and you can just go to ghgprotocol.com or org, I guess, and download them, and you can start to see what you have to do. And there's a lot of process around this, and it's basically accounting. So you can think of it as carbon accounting. And so one of the things that I did is I took the glossaries that they had in their documents, plus other things that I've extracted from other standards, and started to build a starter set of a glossary to outline the concepts and definitions that you have, to make it easy to understand what you need and then how it maps to the required standards and reporting. And you can then use that to tag those or associate those terms as well, what we call semantic assignment, to the different data elements in the different systems that you have. And so we can keep track of the fact that if you care about what power is being consumed by this kind of equipment in this manufacturing site, now I can tag that as let's say a scope 1 emission, so that we know where to go and start to gather that information from. And so Egeria's knowledge graph supports this cross-cutting organizational activities and that drive the culture change. Because as we start to do this, as we're getting this collaboration between people to gather the information and to use it and to come up with new ideas in order to reduce the sustainability, to improve the sustainability footprint, that's opportunities for cross-cutting organizational change and cultural change. Just because we've always done something in a particular way doesn't mean it's the most sustainable way to do something. And so perhaps somebody has a better idea that can be incorporated, and we always need to look for those. And so, while again, the Egeria technology can be useful and it can be important, in and itself, it's not really enough to drive process and cultural change. That needs integration with the existing tools that people had. There's funding that often has to be applied to make these real. management focus, opportunities, celebration of success. It's a program that includes the people, the process, as well as the technology and the data. And so we can start to look at this, we can start to follow different threads, and these little bubbles are different capabilities within Egeria that we can leverage. So there's collaboration and feedback, there's knowledge building, there's community building, process improvement, and some of the different capabilities that could be rolled out incrementally with using Egeria to support those different threads of activity. So we've been talking about the greenhouse gas protocol, and so this is a picture that comes, I think, originally might be from the EPA in this particular case. There's really what we talk about as scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are called direct emissions, and so that's the emissions that result from your own activity. And so that means if you have vehicles that you use as part of your business, that includes how much gasoline or diesel they consume. If you have gas turbines that are driving manufacturing equipment or generating your own local electricity, those are stationary sources of emissions. If you have refrigeration equipment, if you are, for example, a retail store, grocery store that uses freezers and refrigerators to keep the food cold, in general, those have a pretty appalling amount of leakage of the gases that are used as part of the cooling process. And so the CFCs, there's actually an agreement called the Montreal Protocol that requires all of the retailers to report on, and this is again through the EPA, that report on how much loss they have of the different CFCs from the refrigeration equipment. And especially if it's not being well maintained, it can be significant. I think the average for grocery stores is that they, on average, lose about 25% of their refrigerants per year. And those CFCs are, as we all know, incredibly potent sources of greenhouse gases that are very destructive to the ozone layer. And so tracking that is very important. In scope 2, those are indirect emissions. And so that's really about purchased electricity. It's also when you can purchase credits that are for renewable energy credits that offset how much electricity you're buying from non-renewable sources. And so you can get into some little bit of funny accounting games around that. Scope 1 and scope 2 are pretty well understood and well defined. And so everybody's pretty comfortable with how they are measured and how they are reported on. Scope 3 is another kind of indirect emissions, but it's about the supply chain. It's about who the carbon emissions from what you are buying from your suppliers, as well as what is going downstream. And so it's a very complicated subject, and it has about 17 different subcategories within it. There's a couple of those subcategories that are well enough understood that people know how to report on them. So things like business travel are very well understood and fairly easy to report on. And in fact, if you notice, or for many of the airlines, when you now fly, they'll tell you how much carbon, what your carbon emission load was. And many of them will now offer that you can purchase, especially credits, essentially credits to offset that by planting more trees or whatever it's going to be. So scope 3 is a little bit controversial. They're still working through the details of how to do that more generally, but it is emerging right now. And so when we want to build a greenhouse gas inventory, we need to get data for that. We need to, for each of these different categories, whether it's stationary combustion, and we need activity data that might include fuel type and amount, and what are some of the common sources. And every one of them, when we do these calculations to compute the impact of, let's say some of your transport vehicles, then doing that uses a certain amount of reference data that's part of the computation to convert fuel of a particular type to carbon emissions. And everything is normalized to what's called CO2e, or carbon dioxide equivalents. And then different scientific institutions come up with this reference data sets, and it's republished or updated every few years. And each country can have different variants of that. And so again, reference data is a key part of how we need to address this. We can talk about mobile combustion or fugitive gas emissions or electric vehicles. And so all these different things have different kinds of activities, and we're capturing information about these activities and trying to compute what the carbon impact is of that activity. And then we have to roll that up across different sites, different organizations. So there's both a geographic roll-up as well as an organizational roll-up, and need to be able to trace through all of that so that it's auditable. And so we can use the data that we have, that we find from relational tables, from messages, from invoices, from other things, and as well as the reference data, and pull all of that information together to then compute a carbon footprint baseline. And there's some basic tools that are part of the greenhouse gas protocol that you plug in the numbers and it pops out your CO2 equivalents. And then you can compare that over time. And there's API versions of this, and companies sell particular software to make it easy to do some of this. But it all follows the same rules and the same process at the end of the day based on the greenhouse gas protocol. And then you take those results and you often want to start to then create a set of dashboards, and I won't walk through all the details, but that can help you to understand at an enterprise level what's going on at a different business unit level, at a functional level, at a geographic level, and start and slice and dice the resulting data in different ways so that it's easy to see what your trends are over time, and if you are on target to meet your goals once you've set your goals, and what you might need to do to change those. And so, we can look at the different kinds of emissions and scope, and look at it per site, and look at it by different kinds of operations. And so there's different kinds of very basic analytics that we do here, which is why a MART is so convenient as a way to store much of this information to do that. And so that's what we do here. And so just to briefly review just what we've gone through here, we walked through a little bit of an initial accounting of carbon emissions based on the data we could find through the data catalogs that may already have existed, or as we go through and catalog more data based upon what we think we need. And we can use Egeria to help with that, or existing tools, whatever is available. And that's just the first step on the journey. And then we know that there's always more discovery and quality analysis, and we find holes in the data. We need ways to measure the quality of the data. And it's an ongoing process year after year that makes it better and better. And we just have to keep on getting better at that, and set our goals around that, and then measure ourselves against the goals. But there's often an opportunity here to improve the processes. In some cases, it actually reduces costs. And so now that we've done this basic work of understanding and aggregating this data, running these computations, now we can identify the opportunities for improvement. We can see that this site's doing much better than that site. We can look at targets for carbon reduction, and we can start to build a culture of sustainability. So as an example, we can look at a little carbon accounting supply chain. And so I mentioned Egeria can represent information supply chains, and we can look at how we can get data from operational systems, pull them into an operational data store, load them into a little data mart, and then use that with the computations, sustainability calculators to then build out a dashboard around that. And then we can look at that from a CFC, carbon fluorochloride reduction example about how we would do that in this particular case. It's a pharmaceutical case. So in summary, sustainability is a business transformation. We need to support the collaboration across the business to gather the information, the facts that we need, and to be able to make decisions in a continuous evolution towards your sustainability objectives. Egeria is designed to support this collaboration, and it's one of many ways to use Egeria. And what you do with Egeria here can be used for other use cases as well. This is only once you start to get this data, it opens up a broad portfolio of use cases. Egeria itself is an open source project that's free for people to use. Continues to evolve with the input and support from the community of different software providers and consumers, corporations. The community is more than just software development. It's about sharing experiences and best practices, and it's open to everybody. We welcome your involvement as well. So with that, any questions? I can do a very brief demo of some of the concepts here if we have time, but let me pause here for a minute. No questions? It looks like everybody's on mute. Hopefully I didn't put everybody to sleep like this guy in the middle over here. Okay. Let's see what I have here. So, yes, go ahead.
Real quick, for if any of you do have questions, feel free to unmute yourself. I did let's see. I did go ahead and turn on muting when people joined, but you guys should be able to unmute yourself, I believe. Let's see. Where was that? Where was that?
Okay, so this is just a quick example of one of the user interfaces of Egeria. I will admit that user interfaces is not where we have spent most of our time and effort. It's mostly been on the back end of things. Other people have, some of our users have built user interfaces. In fact, this one was built by ING Bank, which is one of our key stakeholders in the Egeria project. But what I can do is I can put in something like fugitive gas emissions, and I can say I'm looking for either glossary terms, assets, or schema elements. And oops, sign it again. Glossary terms, assets, or schema elements, and search, and I can see that I have a glossary term here. And in fact, this comes from from the greenhouse gas protocol, and I left explicit references in here to make it easy for people to refer back into the standard. That's part of what I've captured, in fact, in the glossary terms is the references. It might be in some cases the most useful part. And then we could, for instance, see that this term for fugitive gas emissions, there's a little what they call a vertical lineage that where we can see that greenhouse gas emissions are coming from this relational table, and making their way into these two different databases. Well, into this glossary category it's related to, and then also over onto here. That's also glossary. So if I look at this, I could look at this table, and I can navigate through the different web of relationships that I have between different data sources, physical sources, as well as logical sources, and the terms. That's one of the primary use cases that the bank has, as they use this in some of their risk management. In fact, I could navigate as well through. Could search through, let's say, scope, and we could look for glossary terms. And here's where scope is showing up, and we can see that, we talked about scope 1 emissions, and here's a little thing on the scope 1 emissions. So anyway, so we can walk through that through this kind of user interface, but we can look at it much more comprehensively as well. This is a different view. I've got to move this out of the way so that I can get to all the buttons. This is more of a graph view, and we can look at all the different kinds of relationships that something has with other things. And so looking at canonical vocabularies, what's changed the latest, the different categorizations, terms, external references, and so forth. If we wanted to, we can take a quick look at the types that we have in the system. And as I mentioned, there are quite a lot of different types, everything from different data file formats, K or JSON or CSV or whatever, IT structure. All these are different concepts that are built in to Egeria. Referenceables, translation details. We also support multiple languages through here that can be attached. So a given term, for example, could have a French definition, a Spanish definition, and an English definition. Different ways of representing schema information through here. And so we can really navigate through a very broad and deep set of concepts here that we can capture of information. And it can also be informal concepts. So informal tags is a useful way to search for things. Different ways to annotate the information, look for duplicates, handle suspect duplicates, and so forth. So anyway, a lot of detail here, a lot of, but the important thing is that you can start very simply and then incrementally extend it or use more features as you need to. And overall, it runs in, I can run it as a standalone Java process, or I can run it in Kubernetes in a cloud or Docker or whatever. Okay, let me stop there. Any other questions? Michael, I think I kept it to about an hour.
Yeah, I think you did a very good job at keeping within the time frame, so I think we're good. If there are no questions, then we're going to end it for tonight. As I mentioned, there are additional sessions going on throughout July as well as into August as well, and additional emails will be going out about those in the near future. But in any case, thank you for attending tonight's session for careers Intact Summer Series. Thank you, Dan, for presenting tonight. Have a good night.
Okay, thank you.